On paper, the Philippines is not a great power. On the map of a Taiwan crisis, it may be one of the most important places in Asia. That is not because of its economy, it is because of where it sits, between the South China Sea and the Pacific, between Taiwan's southern approaches and the wider maritime routes of Southeast Asia, between China's push through the first island chain and America's effort to hold it together. The Philippines does not dominate Asia by size. It shapes Asia by position. It is not a great power, it is a great power hinge. On economic charts, the Philippines looks secondary. It is not the richest country in East Asia. It does not field the region's strongest navy. It is not the industrial center of the Pacific, and it is not the place most people would expect to shape the future of regional security. But then a pattern appears. The Philippines keeps showing up in places where, at first glance, it should not. It appears in Taiwan contingency planning. It appears in American force posture debates. It appears in Chinese gray zone pressure. It appears in discussions about sea lane security, missile coverage, surveillance, dispersal, and alliance credibility. That is the clue. When a country keeps appearing in strategic planning far beyond what its raw economic weight would suggest, the explanation is usually not scale, it is geometry. The Philippines matters because it changes distance, it changes response time, it changes where aircraft can disperse, it changes which sea routes can be monitored, defended, or pressured. And in maritime conflict, those things can matter more than ranking tables. On GDP charts, the Philippines looks secondary. On war maps, it looks essential. That is not an accident, it is a clue. The Philippines does not shape Asia because it is the richest or the strongest. It shapes Asia because of where it sits. Between the South China Sea, Taiwan's southern approaches, and the wider Pacific, its territory changes access, timing, and deterrence. It is not a great power, it is a great power hinge. So the right question is not, why is the Philippines powerful? The right question is, what does its geography allow others to do or prevent them from doing? That is where the map begins to explain everything. The struggle in East Asia is not only about individual islands, reefs, or airfields, it is about the shape of the region. And one of the most important strategic shapes in the world is the first island chain. This is the arc that runs from Japan through Taiwan and the Philippines toward maritime Southeast Asia. On a normal map, it looks like a line of islands. In strategy, it works like a barrier, a screen, and a set of gateways. For China, the chain matters because it sits between its coastal waters and the open Pacific. For the United States and its allies, it matters because it helps complicate Chinese breakout routes and naval expansion. And that is where the Philippines becomes decisive. Japan anchors the north, Taiwan sits near the center, but the Philippines fills the southern span. Without it, the chain is less coherent. With it, the chain becomes harder to penetrate. This is not about the whole country equally. A few parts of the Philippine map matter far more than others. Northern Luzon matters because it faces the waters south of Taiwan. Palawan matters because it runs along the eastern edge of the South China Sea. Balabac matters because it sits near a critical approach between Palawan and Borneo, and the Luzon Strait matters because it connects enclosed waters to the open Pacific. Many Taiwan war games quietly begin on Philippine runways, not in Taiwan itself. That sounds strange until you look at the map. A conflict near Taiwan would not stay neatly around Taiwan. It would spill south into the air and sea space around northern Luzon. Access there affects response time, dispersal, resupply, surveillance, and evacuation. That is why a mid-sized archipelago keeps appearing in scenarios centered on an island farther north. The map is wider than the headline. This is the core logic. The Philippines is not strategically important in isolation. It is important because it links systems that are usually discussed separately. Taiwan, the South China Sea, the first island chain. Alliance credibility. Once those are connected, the country stops looking secondary. It starts looking central. The most important geography is often not the land itself, but the water around it. Between Taiwan and the northern Philippines lies the Luzon Strait. Within that space is the Bashi Channel, one of the most important passageways between the South China Sea and the Pacific. To most civilians, these are just names on a map. Strategically, they are far more than that. They are gateways. That matters for surface fleets. It matters for aircraft. It matters for logistics. And it matters especially for submarines. A navy trying to move between more enclosed seas and the open ocean needs usable routes. The Luzon Strait is one of the most important routes in Asia. The same channel used by civilian traffic is also one of the most important underwater highways in Asia. The Luzon Strait is not just a line between Taiwan and the Philippines, it is a gateway between the South China Sea and the Pacific. That makes it critical for fleets, aircraft, logistics, and especially submarines. A normal-looking stretch of water becomes strategic because it connects theaters, and whoever can monitor or use that gateway changes the entire regional equation. Now, the contradiction becomes sharper. If northern Luzon shapes the southern approach to Taiwan, and if the Luzon Strait shapes movement between seas, then the Philippines is not just near a future crisis. It is built into the operating environment of that crisis. That is why Taiwan war games keep drifting south, not because the Philippines is the main battlefield, but because the northern fight becomes harder to sustain without the southern hinge. And this is also why the South China Sea cannot be separated from the Taiwan question as neatly as many people assume. The same waters that carry commerce can also carry coercion. The same routes used in peacetime can matter in war for dispersal, resupply, withdrawal, blockade, pressure, and civilian evacuation. This is the water between theaters, not officially one battlefield, but increasingly one system. If the map explains the structure, the South China Sea explains the method. Because this contest is not only about geography, it is about how to change the map without openly starting a war. That is where gray zone conflict comes in. Gray zone pressure is coercion below the formal threshold of war, not peace, not full-scale combat, something in between. In the case of the Philippines, that has often meant pressure around places like Scarborough Shoal and Second Thomas Shoal, water cannons, blocking maneuvers, ramming, harassment of fishermen, pressure on resupply missions. These are not random incidents. They are not isolated scuffles. They are a pattern. These are not random Coast Guard scuffles. They are rehearsals for how far China can push without triggering war. That is the real meaning of repeated clashes around Philippine outposts and resupply boats. If you value calm, in-depth explanations like this, subscribe to Beneath Systems for more videos that uncover the systems shaping our world. The objective is not just harassment, it is to test thresholds, probe reactions, and slowly change reality at sea without crossing the line that would force a full military response. Gray zone pressure is pressure designed to stay deniable, limited, and useful. Why use this method? Because it exploits ambiguity. A navy firing missiles is obvious. A Coast Guard vessel blocking a resupply boat is politically murkier. It creates friction without formal escalation. It tests treaty language without triggering treaty certainty. And that is why major powers watch these incidents so closely, because they are not really asking whether one boat got sprayed with water. They are asking something larger. How much pressure can be applied before alliance commitments become real? How much daily coercion can change facts on the water? How long can incremental intimidation reshape behavior without producing open conflict? In the South China Sea, the alliance front line is often not the Navy. It is the Philippine Coast Guard. That is what makes this system so unusual. The daily confrontation is often carried not by large warships, but by white-hulled vessels, fishing boats, escorts, and resupply missions. The service most visible in the contest is often the one that sits between civilian law enforcement and military signaling. The front line does not always look like a battlefield, and that reveals the real target. China does not need a major battle to gain advantage. If Manila becomes more cautious, more restricted, or more intimidated in its own waters, pressure has already produced results. Which means the contest is not only about territory, it is about precedent. If gray zone pressure tests resolve at sea, alliance access shapes the answer on land. This is where EDCA matters. EDCA is the framework that gives the United States access to selected Philippine sites for rotation, storage, training, and infrastructure. Publicly, these sites are often described in terms people can easily accept: disaster response, humanitarian use, pre-positioning, training support. Those functions are real, but they are not the whole story. Because in operational terms, access sites change options. A few airfields and facilities in the right places can alter logistics, surveillance, dispersal, and denial. They can shorten response time. They can support aircraft rotation. They can improve sustainment. They can make targeting harder by spreading forces instead of concentrating them. They can widen the number of places from which intelligence, movement, and support can occur. Publicly, these sites are about disaster response. In war planning, they become logistics hubs, surveillance nodes, and operational access points. That is the real meaning of EDCA. A location does not need to be a giant permanent base to matter. In modern conflict, access can be more valuable than ownership. A handful of sites in Cagayan, Isabela, Palawan, or Balabac can change timing, dispersal, and reach. Sometimes strategy is not about building more, it is about standing in the right place. This is why Washington cares so much about access, because access determines distance. Distance determines response time. Response time shapes deterrence. A crisis is not only about strength, it is about whether useful strength can arrive, survive, and operate quickly enough. Japan is the northern anchor, Taiwan is the central lock, the Philippines is the southern hinge that can hold or open the chain. That is the simplest way to understand its role. It is not the largest military in the region. It does not need to be. Its territory shapes the coherence of the first island chain. If that southern span becomes reliable, breakout routes get harder. If it becomes porous, pressure on the chain increases. Geography does not fight alone, but it decides where fighting becomes possible. But access is not the same as automatic alignment, and that is where the political dilemma comes into view. Manila wants protection, but it does not want entanglement. That is the Philippine dilemma. The country has clear reasons to strengthen deterrence against Chinese pressure in its own waters, but it also has reasons to avoid becoming the launchpad for a larger war it does not control. Washington wants access, but not uncontrolled escalation. Beijing wants to pressure the Philippines, but without triggering a direct military clash with the United States. That means all three sides are trying to operate in a narrow zone, enough pressure to shape behavior. Not so much pressure that the system snaps. The Philippines wants American backing against China, but it does not want to become the launch pad for someone else's war. That is the core tension. Manila needs security support, yet it also needs room to say no, slow things down, or manage political risk. Its leverage comes not only from hosting allied access, but from deciding where, when, and under what conditions that access can be used. The hinge matters because it can still move, and that is why pressure on the Philippines is about more than one reef, one shoal, or one resupply mission. It is also a regional signal. Pushing the Philippines is not only about one reef, it is about teaching every Southeast Asian claimant what resistance will cost. If Manila, a treaty ally with international legal backing and growing external support, can still be pressured daily, then other states receive the message. Accommodation may look safer than resistance. Precedent spreads faster than headlines. This is how a local dispute becomes a regional lesson. That returns us to the larger pattern. The Philippines matters because it is the southern lock in the first island chain. If it becomes reliable and resilient, Chinese breakout becomes harder. Deterrence becomes stronger. Alliance planning becomes more credible. The map holds. If it hesitates, restricts access, or yields under enough pressure, the chain does not disappear, but it becomes easier to break. If the Philippines restricts access or folds under pressure, the first island chain does not disappear. It becomes far easier to break. That is the strategic consequence. The issue is not whether one country wins or loses by itself. The issue is whether the regional geometry becomes tighter or more porous. A hinge does not need to dominate the structure to matter. It only needs to fail at the wrong moment. That is why pressure on Manila matters far beyond Manila. So the deeper truth is this: the Philippines is not strategically decisive because of what it produces. It is strategically decisive because of what it connects. Taiwan to Southeast Asia, the South China Sea to the Pacific. Alliance promises to operational reality. Gray zone pressure to deterrence credibility. It is the place where maps become strategy and where strategy becomes daily friction. That is why Coast Guard clashes are not minor incidents. That is why airfields in the north matter more than ranking tables. That is why a modest economy can become central to great power rivalry. Because the Philippines is not a great power. It is a great power hinge. If Japan anchors the north and Taiwan locks the center, then the real question is whether the southern hinge holds. Because if it does, the first island chain becomes harder to break, and if it does not, the consequences will reach far beyond the Philippines. If this video gave you a clearer way to understand the world beneath the surface, subscribe to Beneath Systems for more deep dives every week.